If you turn to page 33 in your blue workbook, so that's the blue workbook 3 for bus 2, there's some of the space for the key terms. Now, I'm not going to talk about each of these right now. We're going to look at them as we follow along. It will be your responsibility to keep referring back to that page, and you might need to include some space in your exercise book for each of these terms. So it's terminology that will help us describe to the examiner what we understand by the term organisational structure. If you want, as an alternative, you can go to your small definition book and you can try and write the definitions in there. So when we look at the organisational structure, you'll see it as a picture, and we look at the organisational chart. So it shows the management hierarchy in the business. So it'll look at how the people interact. We generally start from the top and work through to the bottom, and it will always have a variety of different shapes depending on how the organisation manages itself. And we'll learn about 3 different things as we look at these diagrams: the span of control, the line management, and the chain of command. If you turned to page 7 in the blue book, there's an opportunity for you to draw this. This in itself would most likely be representative of the functional organisational structure. So here is the hierarchy, how things are organised, and you can see that there's a managing director that governs the whole business, and you can see the functional areas. So they've found that they've got a sales director, a marketing director, and a finance director, and it's up for each business to decide which way to define these. And you can see that the sales director has 4 employees under their control. The marketing director has 2 areas which might have several people below it, and the finance director has 3 managers below him. So when we consider the functional structure, then there's obviously going to be positives and negatives towards it. So remember, functional structure means it's likely to be in departments, and each will have separate levels of management which are responsible for it. What are some of the good things then? Well, when we consider the entrepreneur who started their first business, remember we described them as jack of all trades, so they had to do everything by themselves. It's much more advantageous once you adopt a functional structure. Everybody can look to develop their own skills, and it leads to specialisation. And when that occurs, the business will become more efficient, and we know that it should become more cost effective. Someone is responsible for all sections, so each person will have someone at the top of it, each section will have someone at the top of it that you know is the point of contact, and they can then take actions for the whole function. It's easier to know your and other roles. So when you see this diagram, when you see the hierarchy of the organisational structure, especially for new employees, at least they can identify who's in charge of who has responsibility, and who you can contact as your next person. What are some of the disadvantages? Close communication could lead to a lack of focus. Remember, it's organisational objectives that we're trying to meet. And if one department, one functional area doesn't talk to others, then you might find that not everybody is striving towards the objective. Departments can become resistant to change. If you're only in 4 walls, if it's easy enough to see it like that, you might not see that there's actually better ways to do things out there. Coordination can take too long. If you've got to go through a chain of communication, so if you can only talk to somebody else who then has to talk to another person, that might take a long time in order for the organisation to act as one. And there's clearly going to be a gap between the top and the bottom, and depending on how many levels there are, that could be quite extensive. So when we look at the span of control, the definition is the number of employees for whom a manager is required to supervise directly. So I think if there's two descriptions. So there's the wide span of control when you have one person looking over a variety of different people, but then you have a narrow span of control. So we can see with the narrow span of control, it's very easy to know what your subordinates are doing. You could check up on 2 people far easier than you would be able to check up on 9 or 10 people. So what does it depend on? Well, it could depend on the personality of the manager, if they like to take responsibility for people. It could also be dependent on their skill and experience. A new manager might prefer to have a very narrow span of control till they find their feet in the organisation, whereas a manager who's been there for several years might have a much wider range in ability and therefore be able to oversee a greater number of people and not feel overwhelmed or stressed by it. You could look at the size and complexity of the business. So maybe as a business is only medium size or maturing, it might only have several functional areas, in which case a wider span of control is much more cost efficient. And if the business doesn't have money to spare, then it's highly unlikely to have more levels of the hierarchy and so supervisor or manager's positions. We'll look at whether the business is centralised or decentralised, and I'm going to show you a diagram in a couple of slides that will help you. We'll spend more time focusing on that. And the extent of use of clear objectives throughout the business. So let's say, for instance, if you've got one owner that's grown from being a small business, an entrepreneur, they might find that they don't want to have managers, and so they might see that they're the driving force of the vision, and so have a wide span of control so that they can ensure that everybody knows these objectives. So we're going to look, some theorists suggest the span of control between 3 and 6, others between 6 and 12. So it's really important that we don't make sweeping generalizations. It's important that you read the case study fully. You look for indications of what skills, what expertise, how do you think the manager reacts to people. At this point, you can think about your motivational theorists and how they might see the difference between a wide span of control, where your manager isn't always going, what you're doing now, or a narrow span of control where you need the extra guidance from your manager. At this point, I'm going to ask you to turn off this video and refer to your blue book. So I would like you to look at the case study. There's an article that I would like you to read. The article is on page 17 of the blue book. It's called, Is There a Right Span of Control? And I'm going to ask you to challenge yourself at this point. Get out your highlighter pen, but you can only use it 10 times. So I'm asking you to think before you react. What are the important points that you feel this article offers you in terms of what you can add to an exam question? So moving on with some other things then. So we're going to look at the definition for a chain of command. So I've written, it describes the line of authority within a business. So in order to talk more about authority and where command is given, I would like you to draw the diagrams for the hierarchy. So I think if you turn to page 11 of your blue book, the title of the page is Hierarchical and Flat Structures. So when we look at the authority, it's easy in a diagram, but perhaps it gets a bit overwhelming if we were to add everybody. So the levels of hierarchy are the number of layers of a management or supervision in an organisational structure. So we've just finished talking about span of control. Now, if you look at the picture for a flat hierarchy, that's likely to have a wide span of control, and you can see that by the extra width involved in the triangular shape. So we'll have a few layers of management, and each layer of management will look after many more subordinates. In opposition then, the tall hierarchy, you can see it's a much more narrow span of control, so it's likely to involve managers who only look after a much more minimal level of number of people. Before I start talking about this slide, I'd like you to think we're building up towards exam-style questions on organisational structures, and I want to provide you with, I suppose, a bit of a checklist that you could look or you could use in your answers. Now remember, we've been trying to do 5 steps between making our point and finishing a good analysis. So use your BLT, your because leads to therefore, and let's consider some of the things. So in a tall structure, you've got to make the statement, show the examiner you know there are many layers of the hierarchy and it's likely to have a narrow span of control. Much more likely, because you're only looking after a few people, that you'll have much tighter control of what your employees are doing. You're likely to not ask them to have as much to make many decisions themselves. But because there's more levels in the hierarchy, there's more opportunities for promotion, and we know that reward of promotion motivates lots of employees. It's longer for communication to pass between the layers, and that might mean that you're not a particularly quick and responsive business, so you might miss opportunities to carry out business and grow. Because of the levels of supervision in here, we're going to have much higher costs. But remember, costs just aren't associated with employees' salaries or wages. You could look at some of the ideas that we've looked at in efficiency, unit cost. We could look at, if you think about communication, the fact that you have recruitment and selection costs in there. And we can see then that if it was a flat structure that you looked at, it's the same sort of things that you can develop. Right, we're going to do some drawing here. So the first slide is a centralised structure. So if you look at page 10 in your blue book, I would like you to draw this somewhere on that page. So you can see in the centre the MD, your managing director. So that's likely to be an entrepreneur if it's the same people who own and manage and run the day-to-day business as what started it. So it's likely that they're the pin in the centre, and even though each of the functional areas are around the outside, it's always going to be fed back to the managing director to make decisions. Then we have the matrix structure, so you need to turn to page 9 in the blue book, and you have a matrix structure. This is perhaps the most complex structure that you'll get. So if I start round about the outside edge, those are all the functional areas that we would know. But let's say, for instance, this business, let's say we're Apple. It's likely that Apple would have several different projects ongoing. So there might be a project for the phone technology. There could be we know that in the past they've had the shuffles and the iPods. There might be a separate project for new business. They might have different projects for different geographical areas, markets, Asia, America, Europe as a thing. So it's likely that the projects are for a definitive period, and they almost ask people from different functional areas to work in the project. So it's likely in a matrix structure you have 2 managers. So you might have a project manager and you might have a functional manager. And when the project disbands, you go back to your functional area and you wait for the next project to come along. Okay, so we can look at a term that you might come across called delayering. So what is delayering? So if we have a tall hierarchy with a narrow span of control, it's cumbersome and it's high costs. And it might be that in a fast-moving market, you might need to reduce your costs. And so it's likely that one of the options you might use to do this is to delayer your organisation. So effectively, what we're going to do is remove some layers of management. So straight away, it's lower labour costs because there will be less people employed in managerial positions and so reduced wages and salaries. Other perceived benefits, so it's likely that these won't come into play straight away because there might be some inefficiency in the organisation while people have their new roles, but over time you might experience faster decision making because there's less people to work through. There'll definitely be a shorter communication path because less levels mean that you might be able to skip a level and go straight up the communication path. And it might stimulate employee innovation. So employees might say, this is my opportunity to stand out from the crowd now. And so because it's less structured, you might be able to be more inventive, come up with different ideas. And it's likely that when it has a flatter hierarchy, you might have communication circles in there. So what else? It widens the span of control. You need to look at the case study and decide, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Look at what you know about these employees and what you know about the managers. And I think there'll be a greater emphasis on teamwork and empowerment. So when we look at each of those, you've got to ask yourself, is there evidence in the case study that we would be successful at this or not? Delegation, then, is the process of passing authority down the hierarchy from a manager to a subordinate. So it's allowing someone else the opportunity to fulfill a task and take ownership of it, make decisions and meet deadlines. Now we've got three other definitions that you need to be aware of when we talk about delegation to ensure that you're using the words in the correct manner. So responsibility, being accountable for one's actions. So if a task has been delegated to you, don't pass the buck. You've got to stand up and say, I'm responsible for this. The authority is the ability or power to carry out a task. It's important if a manager delegates a task that you are given the authority and that this authority is communicated so you don't have to keep explaining yourself. Accountability. So the extent to which a named individual is held responsible for the success or failure of a particular policy, project or piece of work. When you delegate a task, you will still be accountable for it. So although you can give responsibility to someone else, you've got to, at the end of the day, be accountable for it being completed. Delegation is a really good thing to do in order to free up management time. So you've got to look at your manager. If you've got a flat hierarchy and they've got a wide span of control, this could be an excellent tool to motivate your workforce. It also allows you, because you might have a vast number of employees, to use your employees for their local knowledge, especially if it's on a site that you don't normally work for. It allows flexibility. It allows you to give work to employees when you know maybe there isn't an opportunity for promotion at that time. And it's excellent staff development because this would allow you to internally recruit to management positions in the future if they had experience. However, there are some limitations. It's highly unlikely that small firms would do this simply because they might have less people who are able to do this, and the owner, the entrepreneur, might like to take responsibility for themselves. Customer expectations, they might not want somebody with a lower rank to be carrying it out. Depends how managers approach this. We'll look at this below. Your staff might not be up to it. You might have very inexperienced staff, and to delegate tasks might cause more stress than provide a motivational tool. Depends how you react to a crisis situation. Are you delegating it because it is in crisis? Would you be able to take it back? How would your employees feel if that was true? And the matter of confidentiality. So if it's only one person and you go on and delegate it, will they have the same rules as you regarding confidentiality? So to be most effective, these are some of the key things that you need to look at. So it's based on mutual trust. Is there trust between the managers and the employees? The most suitable person is chosen to delegate to. So not because it's your friend, but because they have the skills and the time and the initiative to perhaps carry out the task to the best of their ability. You've got to delegate interesting and challenging tasks as well as the routine, boring ones. Don't give them away just because they're run-of-the-mill and you can't be bothered anymore. Remember, it is supposed to be a motivational tool. You've got to be clear when you're delegating that you explain really, really well. There's no point in just giving a half-hearted guidance, in which case mistakes are likely to be made. This explanation sort of opens up the "I'm here if you need me" so as a support system. If you choose to delegate, authority must be given to the person, the subordinate, and you must effectively communicate to others. So you must not delegate to somebody and then take all the praise yourself. You must let people know that actually someone else has done this. And you've got to be competent enough with your employee to avoid interfering. You can't be checking up on them every 2 minutes, otherwise that relationship of trust will deteriorate. Lastly, we're going to look at employee empowerment. So we've used this word quite a lot. So empowerment is giving employees the power to do their job. So it's likely that they can use their own initiative, that they can make their own decisions, that they can bring the best to their job because they're doing it and they'll be able to be rewarded for it. It's important that employees feel that actions count. So when we looked at like quality circles, it's important that all levels of authority get used to it. So I thought, give authority to make decisions to frontline staff. People who work in retailing shouldn't have to, I'll just have to go and check on my supervisor. Let some of them make decisions themselves. So like, let's say for instance, give them the opportunity to deal with customer complaints. Give them the opportunity to deal with refunds as seen. Encourage feedback from your employees. So ask them, how did they feel about this? It's a two-way action. And I like the idea that it shows trust in your employees and commitment, and that might save you in the long term because they're less likely to go and seek employment somewhere else, giving you recruitment and selection costs. What I would like you to do now is take a page in your exercise book, and for the next few slides, I'll tell you when to finish. You're going to create, you can do it a mind map or you can do it as lists, it's up to you. So I've written on this slide, here are some of the business functions. What I want you to do is, each function is a title, and I want you to try and challenge yourself to write at least 5 things for each functional area. So it's almost as if saying, now we're coming to the end of this course, you need to try and show links between each of the functions. So this is purely a revision exercise for you. On the same mind map then, we're going to use a separate area and we're going to look at 4 common workforce roles. So you're quite used to using these words, but do we really know what might be involved in these workforce roles? So if we look at directors on the left hand side and managers on the right hand side, We can see directors are in overall charge of the business. They're appointed by shareholders. So you've got to ask yourself, what does my case study tell me? Is it a LTD, friends and family, shareholders, or is it a PLC, where shares are owned by the public? And you could try and make a judgment about how many shareholders there are. They're responsible for the key business functions, so they're the one that's in overall charge. It's likely that they have close day-to-day involvement with small and medium-sized businesses, although as soon as you become a PLC, that last bullet point might not be true. So managers report to the directors, and they're likely to be responsible for a specific department or activity. Now, if you looked in your blue book, you can see that actually there are a couple of other organisational structures in there. So let's say, for instance, by geographical area or by customer is on page 8, and directors would be at the managers would be at the top of each geographical area or customer. It's likely that they have budgetary control. So remember, we've done some case studies on that, and it's a motivating tool, but on the downside, we've got to consider that they might not have experience. They have responsibility for their functional area and budget. May delegate tasks to subordinates. So you've got to look at what is their span of control. Do they have perhaps supervisors underneath them? I think their managerial styles will vary. So remember, there are several managerial styles that you can look at, ranging from autocratic, where they make all the decisions. It's likely they probably won't delegate any tasks because they like to keep control of anything. Or might have a more laissez-faire, where they might delegate. So, underneath your managers, you might have a team leader on the left or a supervisor on the right. So, team leaders might work in a matrix structure. So remember we talked about each of the functional areas taking people into the project. So they could be called project team leaders. They allocate workloads, they try and manage resource, keep everything on tasks. And look at the bottom, it's really important. They focus on quality and team motivation. So remember, there's lots of things that you could talk about there. Supervisors is much more traditional then, likely to be in the functional tall hierarchy, allocating jobs to subordinates. Remember that they might have quite a number of subordinates underneath them. They could check quality, so remember we did quality control? It's likely that if they operate quality control, that supervisor would be in charge of that. They can organise staff, so try and work out who might need enrichment, or who might need to be empowered, or who might like job enlargement, and try and maintain some discipline and order amongst the employees. Now, at the end of this task, what I want you to do now is, I want you to go to page 5 in the blue workbook, and there is an organisational chart drawn on there, an organisational structure for you there, and the clues, there is some employees, workforce roles above it, and you've got to try and allocate them into those boxes. Okay, so when we talk about the organisational structure, I've quite often looked at communication. Now, I haven't really got anything for you to particularly write down in this. So I'm only going to say to you, I'll encourage you to create a mind map with communication at the heart of it. It'll be fairly small because obviously we communicate every day and it's second nature, so it's simply just a case of going to bring to your attention some of the things that you might pick up in the case study. So the definition of communication is the process of exchanging information or ideas between two or more individuals and groups. So there's got to be two people for communication to take place. It could be a one-way process where you're giving directions or giving orders, or it could be a two-way process where opinions are being sought and there's a much more emphasis on flow of communication up and down the hierarchy. Internal communication then takes place within the organisation, and external takes place outside. So you've got to think is it a stakeholder? not involved inside the organisation. So individuals, groups and organisations outside the business. You then need to think about whether it's formal communication or informal communication. So it's much more likely for internal communication that it's going to be informal. However, when we look at, let's say for instance, promotion of your staff or perhaps the training of your staff, it's likely to have lots of formal communication involved in those two processes. Whereas external communication is much more likely to be a formal communication, particularly so if you're dealing with customers or if you're dealing with your suppliers. What is the point of having effective communication? So you've got to look for the keys. Does it work or does it not? And what can it add for a business? So, ability to make more informed decisions. It's likely that you'll have collected information and the decisions that you can make will be based on reliable sources. It's easier to implement change, and that's particularly important when it's a fast-moving marketplace. It's important that you implement change and have good relationships with your workforce. Encourages a more motivated workforce. I'm going to say that's particularly true for a two-way, for good two-way communication, where lots of managers have my door is always open policy, and that is a really good thing for employees to know that they can approach their manager or supervisor and be listened to. Helps to ensure the business is well coordinated. So especially if you've got systems in place that should go to specific people, that means that it's likely to be a smoother operation. Allows organisations to be more competitive because you've gained more information, and if your communication is effective, that means everybody should be pulling together to be a team. I'd like to think that if you ever mentioned communication, you would also consider the motivational aspect for your employees. And just to link it to your motivational theorists then, Mayo emphasised the importance of communication in meeting employees' social needs. So you could add it in to any argument you're basing on that. Maslow and Herzberg stressed the importance of recognising employees' achievement and self-esteem needs. And so it's good for you to use those in your answers. Our last activity then, and this finishes improving organisational structures. I want you to create a mind map. The middle title is called How Organisational Structure Affects Business Performance. It's the third bullet point in this section, so you can either refer to the very first slide or you can find that it's written on page 3 in your book. So we're trying to make a judgment really about everything that we know about organisational structure and what impact does it have on your business? Does it allow it to grow and experience growth and be successful, or is it a debilitating factor? So as a business grows, it's much more likely that the organisational structures will be more formalised. So it's likely that you might have not just the owner and an employee, you might have supervisors or managers, you might have more than one location, which involves managers in each location, and someone that's going to view the whole business. You might need to reduce costs and complexity. So actually, you'll get to a point that businesses are going to experience what's called diseconomies of scale. So communication is going to take far too long. There's no coordination anymore because it's so complex. And actually, that's debilitating for our organisation. And so let's reduce costs. So remember, we had rationalisation if you wanted to. Cut out one functional area, cut out one location, reduce the size. So it's likely that we're going to get rid of some supervisors or managers. You might come across a situation where employee motivation needs boosting. You might find that they're not very efficient. You might find that unit costs are really high. And so if we offer someone perhaps a new workforce role, give them supervisory responsibilities, you might find that that increases the motivation, not just of the employee that you've promoted, but other employees who see promotion is now a viable aspect of their job. And of course, there might be something in customer service under quality improvements, and those might be areas that mean you either have to empower your workers or perhaps you actually need to take more time and give them more support and narrow the span of control so that they feel that they're supported. What challenges might we have in order to have the best business performance from our organisational structure? It's likely that employees will be resistant. So remember we talked about why are employees not efficient, why might there be lots of labour turnover, why might there be lots of absenteeism? Well, it's likely that unless you get your workers involved, people are always going to see a negativity. And so you've got to work as having good communication to ensure that there's minimal resistance. You know it's going to cause disruption. You might not be able to do it overnight, and even if you are, you know that whatever the change has occurred, you're going to increase your unit costs. You're probably not going to be as efficient, but in the long term, you will. However, consider the motivation of the people who need the organisational change. What costs are going to be involved? Are they going to be short term or long term? Is there going to be any negative impact on customers and quality? So let's say, for instance, you're changing the organisational structure, you're introducing more formalised communication. It's not likely that everybody will be able to say, oh yes, to a customer, no problem, we'll be able to meet that order. You might have to find that actually you have to go through several layers or even one layer of supervisory in order to say yes. And so your customers might not be happy with that in the short term. Once they see the improvements in your organisation, they might be more satisfied. So, just as we come towards the end of this, I want to draw your attention to things that you could look for. What are you going to assess that might have impacted on your organisation? How big is your organisation? So when we measure size, remember, you can do market share if you like. You can look at the market size. You could look at the number of products that you have. Look at the number of employees you've got. You can look at the value of your organisation. What is the nature of your organisation? You might look simply at how many competitors do you have? Or you might segment yourself into are you a mass market or a niche market organisation? Which market do you try and satisfy? You might go, are you operating in the primary, secondary or tertiary sector? We could look at the culture and attitudes of senior management. So let's say, who are your senior management? How many of them are they? How long have they worked with the business? And I'm not going to get too technical about culture. I'm just going to say how we do things around here. And then, of course, we're going to look at our workforce. Skill and experience. What skills do they have? What skills do they lack and need? What experience do they have? How will you get a more experienced workforce? And finally, we're going to consider what's the organisational hierarchy? What's the span of control? Is there clarity in the lines of communication and accountability? Does delegation occur in the workforce? Do quality circles operate? And how does communication flow within the organisation? Okay, so before we finish, these are key examiner tips. Do you know the difference between a wide and narrow span of control? Do you know which of these belong in a tall or a flat structure. Think about the particular business. No marks for application. You can't make very good analysis unless you're actually looking at the case study. This is a good time to check. Have you got all of the key terms from the slide that I said? Page 33 in the blue book, and you were going to add some extra ones. Finally, a little bit of reading that you can use as an extension activity. If you look in the blue book on page 30 to 32, the last question that we have just answered, how organisational structure affects business performance, is actually tackled in this. Now, I challenged you in the last reading activity to use your highlighter 10 times. This is a smaller case study for you to read. Can you challenge yourself to only find the 7 most important elements that you would like to discuss in the lesson next week?